Welcome, everybody, to the B2B Marketing Playbook. My name's Scott Frymire. I'll be your host for this video podcast series where we tackle some of the pressing questions that emerging marketing leaders in the B2B tech and software space have about how best to contribute to the growth of their organization. Now, I'm going to throw a little bit of a change up at you today because my guest is actually not from the marketing space. He is from the private equity sector. In fact, he is a partner at LLR Partners, a PE firm based out of Philadelphia. He's been doing the private equity thing for probably a little over 2 decades now with LLR, and currently sits on the board of, let's say, about a half dozen B2B software companies. So his perspective is incredibly relevant to our topic of discussion today. I'm happy to welcome to the call David Reuter. David, good to see you again.
Scott, thanks for having me, and happy to be here and chat a little bit.
Terrific. So, hey, before I start firing away with the questions, if I could just ask you, give me a high level about LLR. What type of portfolio companies do you typically work with?
Yeah, so our model is what we call the lower middle market, and these are companies that are typically 10 to 100 million of revenue. We focus specifically on technology and healthcare end markets, and really like those businesses and a lot of the visibility traits that they have, as well as things like high gross profit margin, competitive differentiation, and other moats that make them very stable and reliable businesses. All of our businesses are trying to grow. Some at the lower end, maybe 10 or 15%, others more like 40, 50%. And they're all trying to, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but what I call hack, different techniques to kind of unlock their growth as well. And we're trying to work alongside of them and help them do that.
Great. Well, I've known you for a while, and I'm certainly glad to have you on the show today because we're going to talk about, for those CMOs, maybe a first-time CMO or a head of marketing, VP of marketing, who is preparing to attend their first board of directors meeting, or maybe they have some experience, but not a lot of experience on board meetings. Really getting your perspective from the PE side and somebody who sits on many boards, what you expect to see from the head of marketing. So I'm not going to bury the lead here. I'm going to get right to the meat of it. What is the best advice, David, that you would give to a marketing leader about how to best prepare and show up for a board meeting?
Yeah. Well, and just for the record, I don't know how to spell marketing, so because I'm an investor, and so I don't. Well, let's take all my advice with a grain of salt because all of you are much smarter at the technical aspect, but I can give you some high level points of view. I think the best advice that I've got is around being data driven in decision making as a means and platform to really run a marketing organization. I view marketing as both building the brand and generating leads. And for me, the leads are the key to growth in these companies. And that's where I like to see most of the energy focused. I also think that leads and activity level around them are things that you can track and you can measure. And I think can enable you to be efficient and effective with the spend that you have. So one thing that I often see, and then I'll get to the advice, is companies want to grow, and leadership teams will allocate dollars to marketing and say this is going to help us grow. And more often than not, I see that money spent unwisely or ineffectively. And unfortunately, then you get to the end of the year, and you look at the results and you say, wow, we haven't really increased our lead flow that much, and we've spent a lot more. So now our efficiency is actually much worse than it was before. So my advice is, be data driven in the decision making. And what that means is test new programs, prove early success via data and metrics, and then expand the program and continue to track and tune it so you can maintain those strong results. Because what would be impressive to me if you said, hey, we're going to double the spend in marketing this year, I'd love to see 2.5 times the lead flow, where not only did you utilize that spend well, but you even got more efficient over the course of the year, because I think that can be instrumental in value creation for companies that can, in some ways, control their own destiny on being able to fill the top of the funnel with new opportunities that can lead to that growth over the long run.
Gotcha. So from your perspective then, is it about the marketing leader showing up to the board meeting with a firm grasp of the metrics of their organization and a good understanding of where they should be investing the marketing dollars based off of historical performance of different channels and tactics and offers, or is it something more than that?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I always think about marketing and growth in marketing and lead gen as what I call a stair step function. So I feel like there are channels that you can test, deploy, and expand, but then usually hit a ceiling. So you usually find that with this particular channel, you can extract this amount of lead flow on a pretty consistent basis within your band of what a reasonable cost per lead is. And then sometimes you'll find it eventually gets saturated. So you get to a point where either doesn't produce anymore, literally that you just hit a ceiling, or maybe it continues to produce, but the cost per lead is going up 2x or 3x incrementally, and it's not, you don't get the same ROI. And so I think the challenge is what I call hacks, marketing hacks. How do you find that next stair step? And I think you have to be really creative. And I also think you have to try a lot of things, throwing different ideas at the wall and testing them. Some are going to work, many will not work, and trying to navigate that. But I find that a lot of companies find a couple channels, and by channels, I'm talking, kind of like both program and access point for programs. So am I sending people emails? Am I doing digital advertising?
Hmm.
Maybe those things can be spliced into multiple channels within one category. But I usually find that companies have a handful of channels that they're familiar with. They've been kind of working in for a long time, where they get some sort of long tail benefit from being in that channel, but they kind of run out of steam on most of the channels, and they exhaust them. And I think a lot of people then don't know what to do next.
Right.
And so I think the good marketing leader in a board setting is, be honest about that. Tell us what you know, tell us what you don't know, tell us what you're sure of and what you're unsure of. But then develop that program with some expectations of, how we can try new things as a company and get better, and try new channels that are new, and make progress, and figure that out. And I think that's a pretty consistent challenge that I see in most businesses that we meet, that are not necessarily great at keeping that growth going. Once they've found a few things that work, it's hard to find the next few.
Well, you certainly said a lot there that we can unpack, and I do want to come back to, you talked about being honest and transparent with where you need help, where you're confident. But let's first go to the metric side of things, because I recently recorded another episode of this podcast with a friend of mine who's a CMO, and we were talking about what metrics really matter in marketing. What's the most important metric that you should be looking at to judge not only marketing's contribution, but the growth of the business, potential growth of the business. And he certainly said, hands down, it's pipeline, and that's a joint metric with sales, and it's not just pipeline for the next quarter, this quarter, next quarter. It's could be 6, 9, even 12 months out, depending on your sales cycles and the nature of the business. So when you're in a board meeting, what's the most important metric that you're looking for from the company to gauge how well they're performing? Is it pipeline? Is it cost per lead you mentioned? Is it something else? What do you want to see from a metrics perspective?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So one thing that I struggle with sometimes is in a go-to-market function in a growth company, is where does marketing end and where does sales begin? And I think different companies have different definitions of who sits where and how far a marketing team will take a lead through the process and then do the handoff. So I'll probably bleed a little bit into sales world too. But I think it's a few different things. I do think pipeline creation is important as sort of a gross dollar barometer of how you're doing and what you're generating. So I think that's a good one that someone else mentioned, and I would keep that on my list of top 3 or 5 metrics. I also think cost per lead, in conjunction with pipeline build, is equally as important, because if you told me that I can generate 10 units of pipeline and it costs $10, and then we can go to 20 units of pipeline and it costs $100, I might not want to do that, depending on what my unit economics are. So I think pipeline on its own in a vacuum can be misleading, because you might be spending a ton to get that might not be efficient. So I like looking at the growth factor through pipeline. I like looking at the efficiency through cost per lead. I also think there's this really interesting kind of blind spot of like all marketing in terms of trying to compare and benchmark, which is conversion rates. And so in the companies in my portfolio that I see, Some of my companies will tell me they win half their leads, and some will tell me they convert 3% of their leads. And I'm not actually sure that any of them are different from each other. I think it's just a question of what's a lead and when do you start tracking that conversion. And some do it very, very early when you have a very first touch and it's totally unqualified and pretty low expectation to go with it. Others, do it the opposite, and it's like the sure thing. That's why you're getting a 50% win rate. I'm not sure that those companies are better at selling and marketing than the other, but I think they just track the data differently. So, however you track conversion, I do think that's important too, because I think sometimes if you showed me that you were able to boost your pipeline and maintain a good cost per lead, but your conversion rate drops meaningfully, then I'm not sure that's a good answer either, because you're in some ways maybe just making the pipeline look like it's large, but it's also low quality. And so I think there's a blend in my mind between quantity, which would be your gross pipeline number, quality, which would be your conversion rate, and efficiency, which would come through that cost per lead metric. And I think if you can kind of tune those three together, I think you can have a really powerful outcome that's a real good contributor to the whole.
Yeah, 100% makes a ton of sense. And you're talking about, you mentioned the word honesty before, and transparency, and the way the numbers are presented. I got some advice once from a CEO who said, and I and I'm not sure if I agree with the advice or not, but I think the spirit of it I absolutely agree with. He said, when you sit down for a board meeting, the first thing you want to do is tell everybody on the board all the bad news, the really bad news. And then when you're done, tell them some more bad news. And then when you're done telling them the bad news, put them in absolute pain by telling them something even worse that they didn't know about your business. And then if they don't have any questions and you've told them every bit of bad news you have, then you can start talking about some of the good stuff. But don't rush to the good stuff. Let's focus on. And I think the spirit of what he was trying to say is you don't want a board to ever discover the bad news on their own, because they will. They'll start asking questions. And if you're just trying to paint the rosy picture and you're not coming in there with an honest assessment of the business, it's going to get you. I don't know. Do you agree with that perspective at all?
Yeah, I think that's a good style. To I have a couple buzzwords I like, but I think under promising, over delivering is good. I think hitting the bad news first and making sure you're upfront, straightforward with it is good as well. Um, with that said, I'm trying to change board meetings. I think they've gotten stale as like a concept. Um,
And why is
and
that?
yeah, I think it's a little bit too much of a show. So it's like it's not exactly how they work, but I kind of feel like there's like a script and a stage, and management gets up and puts on the show, and the board members watch and clap or boo or whatever, and then you have lunch and you go home. And I think I've come up with um, some interesting like reasons that maybe that doesn't make sense. And so for us at least, we like to bring people onto the board from outside of our firm and outside of the leadership team of the company, and call those independent directors. And we try to uh, be really thoughtful about where those people come from. So we'd love to find people that come out of the industry that we're working in, and or have had functional challenges that are similar to our company. So if our company is trying to embark newly into international sales, maybe there's a go-to-market person that's done that a few times with success, and that they can come and help to mentor and coach the team. And so because of that, I feel like you have these really smart people in a room that you're trying to get value out of, but we're just doing a show. Like they're just watching a movie of like the quarterly company performance. And so what I've been trying to do, is turn the historical data that typically, is the whole board meeting of reporting out on how the company did last quarter. And in some ways doesn't really matter, because now we're trying to look forward and grow the business and solve problems and make us bigger and make us better, et cetera. So what we're kind of experimenting with, and getting some early traction on, is I think the best meetings are when the leadership team has figured out how to flip the meeting upside down. And what they do, and you have to clear this, of course, in advance with the board members, but what they do is pose one or two strategic questions where they think the board members can provide their wisdom and experience to help the team. I want the team to get value out of the board members, not the other way around. That's why we're bringing the board members there. And the hard part about that is, how does the team present useful data and background information so that you can enable a thoughtful, like kind of hearty conversation and debate that's really connected to the challenges that they need help on? And if you don't give enough of a briefing, then you're going to say, well, the person's too generic, like they don't know our problem and they can't really
Mhm.
help. And so I think that's the difficulty in actually producing a board meeting this way, but it's really done in reverse, and we're really working hard on this with our companies, because we want the teams to feel like they're coming out of these board meetings stronger, with support, with ideas, with vision, with strategy that's influenced by the smart people that are around the table, as compared to just like reporting out and saying, hey, we had a great quarter, or we had a terrible quarter or mediocre quarter. And we're trying to actually take all that and just condense it into a pre-read and say, hey, spend 15 minutes if there's some Q&A that people want to dissect the numbers a bit. That's great. I mean, I think that's worthwhile doing in certain cases. Sometimes, like yesterday, I was at a board meeting literally, and they said, do you want the CFO to walk through the numbers? That's my least favorite time, when literally they're reading to you financial statements that I can just read. And I just said, nope, you don't need to do it. And I actually have no questions. Like, I'm totally in sync with where the business is in this last quarter, pretty much on plan. Let's get into the good stuff. And then the meeting was a lot more interesting, and I think for both sides, because we focus it that way.
So to help facilitate that, I agree with you about the financial statements, but do you prefer to get information a certain amount of time ahead of the meeting? Do you want it 24, 48 hours, 72 hours in advance, a week in advance, so you can mull it over? I mean, you sit on several boards, you're a busy schedule.
Yep.
How much lead time do you like? And do you like the company's team, to your portfolio company team, to put together kind of, here's the kind of motif that we're going to be riffing on during this call. This is where we're going to get the most value if we can get your feedback here. Do you want that ahead of time?
Yeah, totally. So I guess two parts to the answer. The first part is for bread and butter stuff, like, hey, these are the financials and here's some of the metrics kind of by function of the business. We do try to push our companies to have those done about a week in advance, just to allow people to have time to read it and read it thoroughly, because a lot of times you get it the night before and you just really don't have time. On the other part that I was describing, of this like flip upside down, much more strategic collaborative session, I think that the arc that is, like, in a lot of cases will turn out to be different than like a send out a package a few days before and talk about it. I think those things are more of a journey, where there may be several sessions, and we're even starting to change the board meeting cadence to say, we don't need to have a 4-hour meeting just because it's the end of a quarter. We have nothing to talk about. But but then there might be some point, like we have one company that had a lot of negative surprises to their gross margin profile, because the business went through a really strong growth period and expanded their product set, but a lot of additional costs showed up that they weren't really anticipating. So the margin profile turned out to be a lot lower than what they were budgeting. And we decided as a group, we're going to unpack that. We're going to create this tiger team to kind of go and try to dig deep into the data, present a lot of this analysis back to a small group of people that are going to try to help kind of re-engineer where we go on that. And we're going to do, meetings once a week for 30 minutes to sort of unpack this and try to figure out where to go next. And that's just a
Mhm.
better working cadence to be able to do what we need to do the heavy lifting. And then we have the outside board members that are really primed to plug into that and help with that. But they need that background information to be able to be dangerous and helpful, in that conversation. And I think if you try to distill it down to like one meeting with one pre-read, you lose a lot of the texture of what's there. So I think that last part is the trick of making these board meetings strategic, is how do you get the board members up to speed enough on the real issues so they can contribute? Because a lot of times, there's a big gap. Somebody's in the company working 24/7 on a business problem as a leader of a department, and they've got all these other people that are supporting them in that too. And then you have a board member who's checking in periodically. So it's like there's a big knowledge gap between those two people. So we're trying to figure out like how do you fill in enough to make it productive, to make it strategic, to make it useful where the team walks away. My goal is the team walks away and says, wow, I feel like I learned a lot and I have a lot of perspective on where to go next with solving this challenge or tackling this opportunity.
And do you prefer? I mean, I've been part of companies where the CEO and the CFO would go on the board meetings, but nobody else, and other companies where the entire leadership team would be on the board meetings. From your perspective, do you have a preference? Is there a size that gets a little bit too big and not productive, or too little and not valuable enough?
Yeah, it's a good question. My favorite way to do it is a combination. What I like to do is a bit of a round robin, and we'll try to bring in a functional lead, but just one per meeting, but do a much deeper dive. So instead of saying we're going to go through sales, marketing, product, engineering, human resources, financial, all in one board meeting, let's sort of like do the housekeeping and then do a deep dive into go to market and bring in the sales leader, bring in the marketing leader, tee us up to be able to dig deep into one or two strategic questions that we can really unpack in a real strategic way. And have those people engage in that meeting, engage in the prep for that meeting, and then being able to leave that meeting saying that they gain some advantage by going through that process. And then maybe the next session you're going to go and do that with product and kind of rotate around. So probably like once a year, do that deeper dive kind of per key area of the business. But I feel like that's a good blend where I do feel like sometimes when you have everybody there and then you're doing a lot of different segments, and a lot of times like the management teams have their own meetings to prep for the board meetings, so they already know all that. So it's just a lot of hours that
And
like,
it's hard to go deep in any
yeah,
specific
that's right.
function
And
of the
you're
business,
in,
I
yeah,
think, right?
that's right. And you're racing through a high level overview that everybody already knows anyway. So I'm like, I'd rather have all the people in that room doing their job, out meeting with customers and growing the business and training people and all that stuff versus like just trying to entertain me. So I think we're trying to find a hybrid where but at the same time, I feel like if there's like no interaction with the team, I think that's a loss, for the team and for the board. So we're trying to find a blend to do a little bit of both.
Makes total sense. So you've given some great advice. You've certainly talked about having a firm grasp on the numbers and the metrics as a marketing leader, coming in prepared to talk about that and know where you're making investments and is it going to be fruitful. You talked about honesty, transparency. Listen, are there any mistakes that you see marketing leaders make when they attend a board meeting where you're like, I wish they hadn't done that?
Yeah. The the biggest mistakes that I see, and I see these pretty consistently, unfortunately, it feels like a common pitfall is, I do think people ask for more money blindly without really a use of proceeds. So I think, when a company raises money, we push them to say, why do you need the money? How are you going to spend the money? And I think we try to do that in a more sort of functional level, detailed orientation too. So any executive that shows up and says, I'd like to increase my budget, and no executives don't want to increase their budget, we say, great. Well, how are you going to spend it? And what are your results going to be, of that spend, and convince us? Because I always tell people you can have as much money as you want, as long as you can deploy it efficiently and show me a return on it. And then there's like no debate. If you can show me a good return, capital is unlimited. So what I see a lot in marketing is, asking for money blindly and not really being prepared to explain like why they want the amount they want or how they're going to deploy it. And then I also see people for whatever reason, being given access to that capital without a good plan, and then just throwing kind of good money after bad, into some marketing programs and attempted growth just because they feel like they don't know what to do. So we'll just push the accelerator in all the areas and see what happens. And what I often see is then you have like much worse marketing efficiency on generating leads and building pipeline, and you've spent a lot more, but really have very little, if anything, to show for it. And so I think back to the beginning point, if you know what you're trying to do first, and then get the money after, and then if you think that's a good idea, but like then go test it and prove it in small increments, and then go. And I think you have to push back a little bit on the CEO or on the board or whoever's kind of calling for hey, we want to ramp up our growth rate. You go do that. Here's some money, and then like maybe you feel like you're being pressured to spend that, but you don't really have a great plan. So I like the plan first, test second, and then when you see those things come together, then you can really push the accelerator with some confidence. And I think look a lot better as like a business partner to the people that are calling for the growth when you can either deliver it or come back and just be honest and say, I tried all the things I know, but the growth isn't there. Let's go troubleshoot that.
Solid advice. Hey, listen, I want to wrap this up by asking you the same three questions we ask all our guests. And even though I know you're from the private equity sector, you have a bit of marketing. So you said you can't spell marketing. I know that's not true. I know you work with a lot of marketers and CMOs. So let me ask you first, what's the best bit of marketing advice you've ever received in your life?
Yeah, so I really like the concept of stair step marketing, and the way I think about that or explain that is I think the concept of lead generation is a stair step concept, meaning that each idea that you have of a place you're going to get leads, it could be a conference, it could be the concept of conferences, it could be digital advertising or different slices of where you spend digital ad dollars. I think each little category can be effective or not. And I think each little category, has a certain point where you can grow efficient lead production to, and then it kind of peters out. Um, and so I think what we see a lot in businesses that we evaluate is they found half a dozen interesting ideas, concepts, channels that they're doing effective lead gen through, and there's a platform that's in place, and that's what's driving kind of their current sales volume. And then they're telling us we can keep growing, we can keep scaling this, but they don't know what the next thing is, and they've kind of exhausted the ideas and channels that they have going today. So, I have this word I like to use of hack. I think you have to become a growth hacker and to be able to, really get creative, um, and get very comfortable with the test mindset of being able to say, yeah, and just being honest, like, hey, we get 30 leads from this place and we get 50 leads from this place and 20 leads from this place, and we tried this other one and it didn't work well and we didn't get any. Um, and just continuing to tune that. So I think thinking about it in stair steps and thinking about the concept of adding stairs, as each growth kind of dimension comes to fruition, and being able to like just develop that into a process where you can test and deploy and test and deploy, I think is a solid way to do that. And I think necessary for most companies that really want to grow for the long term.
Makes sense. What about the you see a lot of marketing technology with the companies that you work with, your portfolio companies. Is there any marketing tech or marketing tool that you're absolutely in love with?
Yeah, I really like marketing automation, and I believe in the concept of one-to-one focus and differentiation. And that to me really comes through the form of account-based marketing. And a couple tools that I'm into now, and these always kind of come and go, but I really like Sixth Sense that's helping with that account-based marketing activation. And then there's a tool called Bombora that's helping to identify intent and help you lead score to figure out who's really ready to buy. And lastly, I like some of the outreach automation tools. There's one that's called Outreach, there's one that's called Sales Loft, that are helping you, I think, more programmatically ping and connect, sometimes annoy these prospects to kind of pull them into sales cycles, and hopefully using that Sixth Sense and Bombora data to help prioritize where you're going. But I think marketing has changed in my career. I started investing in software companies in the late 90s, so it's not that long, but it's also a good amount of time. Marketing's probably been the area that's evolved the most, because when I started, companies didn't have websites. Most companies didn't use email, right? So it was a very manual process of like advertising and physical publications and going to trade shows. That was like most of where people spent their time. And then starting the early days of trying to build lists that you would mail or call, right? Like the digital side that represents a lot of it
Hey,
today
hold
didn't
on.
exist.
You can date yourself. Don't start dating me too. No,
Yeah, I'm with you. So, but I think to stay ahead, you've got to realize that the evolution has been fast over the last 20 years. And it's going to keep going in my mind. So I think you have to really try to stay on the forefront if you want to be ahead of your competition.
Yeah, and to the tools you mentioned, certainly outreach, sales loft tools, I'm both familiar with. I agree with you. I think they're also great because they really help align sales and marketing more tightly, because you have the BDR team that's working with the material that marketing's arming them with to have conversations. And it's not like there's a marketing nurture track of email drip campaign thing going over here, and the BDRs or the SDRs are doing something totally separate. It really helps align the two teams, which I tend to like. Last question. Is there anything that you would recommend that other marketing professionals start doing more of and stop doing?
Yeah, I think they're interconnected. So I'd say stop rushing to spend money until you have proven results. I would say very few companies of mine haven't done that mistake at least once, where they've overspent and then brought back weak data and then said, "Man, we shouldn't have done that." And it'd be great just to get ahead of that and not do it first and save the money and then be able to have better outcomes because you're testing. And then, what I'd start doing more of is really, being focused on data supported decisions. And again, back to like 20 years ago, we didn't have sales and marketing data 20 years ago like we have today. So it was a lot more instinctual. Today, there's unbelievable amounts of data, maybe too much. But I think you've got to figure out how to use it and figure out how to use it thoughtfully because sometimes it can be overwhelming and distracting. So you've got to find the right data points that work for your business, your category, your market, and then leverage those to give yourself an advantage in evolving your own marketing function.
Well, it's great advice and a terrific perspective that I think our viewers will find value in, if they are, in fact, prepping for their next board meeting, and how to be in the right mindset and come with the right data, and show up to have that conversation with the board of directors. So, David, thank you very much. I want to remind everybody also that this video podcast series is sponsored by Tidewater CMO, fractional CMO services for companies in the B2B tech and SaaS space. Be happy to have a conversation with you if you're looking for help there. But in the meantime, David, really appreciate your time today. Wish you the best, and I look forward to chatting again soon. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you, Scott. I appreciate it.